The first thing Daniel Carter heard was the sound of metal against stone. Not loud, not sharp, just the faint rhythmic scrape of something struggling against something else. At first he thought it was a piece of farm equipment carried by the wind. Then he heard it again. A chain being pulled, released, pulled again. He stopped on the trail boots, planted in the Montana dirt, and listened. The forest had a way of telling him when to pay attention. That morning it spoke in whispers. When Daniel stepped into the clearing, the world tilted. There, in a patch of flattened grass, was a young grizzly bear cub. Her body was small for her age, about the size of a Labrador retriever, but her shoulders carried the promise of the giant she might have become. Around her neck was a chain rusted and tight-bolted to an iron stake in the ground. She lifted her head when she saw him, the movement slow, heavy, and the sound came again, the dull scrape of metal as she tested her limits. For anyone who has ever seen a wild animal in its element, free to move, free to run, the sight of a grizzly, confined like a backyard dog, is almost impossible to process. Grizzly bears are not pets. They are powerful, instinctive, essential creatures of this landscape. Yet here she was, chained in a way that stripped her not just of freedom, but of dignity. Daniel stood frozen, not from fear, but from the weight of the moment. He had seen fire swallow valleys, had seen homes collapse under the heat of a Montana summer blaze, but this felt different. Here was suffering condensed into a single image, a cub tethered by human hands, her life reduced to the radius of that chain. This is where the story begins. Not with a fight, not with a roar, but with silence. A silence that demanded action. And the lesson hidden inside that silence is this: suffering doesn't always scream. Sometimes it scratches faintly at the edges of your attention, waiting for someone, just one person, to notice. Across the United States, wild animal stories like this surface more often than people realize. In backyards, roadside cages, makeshift attractions, bears, lions, tigers, and wolves are chained or confined in ways that betray their nature. According to estimates from wildlife protection groups, thousands of large carnivores live in private captivity, many in states with weak regulations. A grizzly cub chained in Montana is not just an isolated cruelty, it is a mirror of something larger. The quiet ways animals become victims of human neglect. Daniel knew none of those statistics in that moment. He only knew what was right in front of him. The cub's paws were raw from pacing, her fur rubbed thin where the collar dug in. She didn't lunge or growl. She looked at him the way a lost child might, with a mixture of fear and the faintest thread of hope. That was the heartbreak. Even chained, even starved of freedom, she hadn't forgotten how to look for connection. When people talk about animal rescue, they often focus on the dramatic moments, the breaking of glass, the cutting of locks, the triumphant release. But the real rescue begins here, in the instant someone chooses not to walk away. That choice carries weight. Think about the times in your own life when you noticed something wrong, but weren't sure if it was your place to intervene. A child crying in a grocery aisle. A neighbor's dog was left outside all night in the snow. A bird was tangled in fishing line by the lake. The difference between harm continuing or healing beginning is often a single decision to stop, to look closer, to care. What Daniel saw in that clearing was not just a chained grizzly bear, it was a question. Will you keep walking, or will you bear the responsibility of seeing? Here's a fresh perspective. We often think of rare animals and endangered animals as distant issues, something happening in polar regions or rainforests. But cruelty does not respect geography. It shows up in the quiet valleys of Montana, in places where you least expect it. That realization can change the way we think about our daily lives. The wilderness isn't just out there in documentaries. It brushes against our towns, our roads, our routines. And when wild animals enter that fragile boundary between their world and ours, our response reveals something about who we are. Daniel took a slow step forward. The bear shifted, muscles tense, but she didn't retreat. He could see the tremor in her flanks, the exhaustion of days, maybe weeks of captivity. Her paw lifted, pressed against the earth, and then came down again with the faintest clink of chain. A sound he would never forget. Think about that sound for a moment. A chain is not just a tool, it is a language. For her, each scrape was a sentence written in desperation. I cannot move. I cannot breathe. Will anyone notice the paw prints she left in the dirt were not random? They were messages repeated over and over in a circle too small for a creature meant to roam mountains. And here lies the small lesson. We often expect distress to appear in obvious ways, loud cries, frantic movement, but neglect is quieter. It repeats itself in patterns, the same paw prints circling the same stake, the same sighs from someone suffering in silence. To recognize it requires stillness, the willingness to listen to what is not shouted. Daniel did not know it yet, but the chain in that clearing would become more than an object to remove. It would become a symbol. Just as the cub had been held back by metal links, he too had been bound by invisible ones, memories of fire losses, unspoken regrets that looped around him like chains he couldn't cut. Saving her would mean facing his own confinement. This is what makes wild animal stories powerful. They don't just describe the animal, they hold up a mirror. The bear cub's fight to live was also Daniel's fight to live. That is why stories like this crush your soul, because they show you the places in yourself that have gone unnoticed, the parts chained quietly while the world rushes by. As he stood there, Daniel remembered the words of a ranger he once trained under, "The forest never hides suffering. It only waits for you to look." And that's the perspective worth carrying. Animals don't have a voice in our language. They rely on us to translate their signals, paws against glass chains, against stone eyes that linger a little too long. The translation is simple, they are asking for help. Daniel inhaled the pine air, steadying himself. His boots pressed into the earth, leaving prints that joined hers in the dirt. For the first time in years, he felt the pull of purpose stronger than the weight of his memories. This wasn't just about a bear cub. It was about answering a call. And here's where this story turns from a clearing in Montana to something larger. Across the country, countless animals live in chains, cages, or cars under unbearable heat. The ASPCA reports that every summer, hundreds of pets die in parked vehicles, their owners convinced it'll just be a minute. Wildlife sanctuaries fill with creatures pulled from basements, sheds, and roadside cages, each one a reminder that neglect wears many disguises. We cannot solve it all at once, but we can solve it one act at a time. That morning, Daniel chose not to walk away. He took another step toward the cub. Another chain link scraped, another plea answered. And that is where the story of her fight and his truly begins. Because what Daniel did next would not only decide the fate of one grizzly bear cub, it would test the strength of his own heart, the resilience of a man who thought his days of saving lives were long behind him. Daniel Carter woke before dawn, as he always did. Years of firefighting had trained his body to rise when the sky was still dark and the air still cold. Even in retirement, the rhythm stayed. Coffee in a dented thermos, boots by the door, silence heavy around him. He lived in a small house outside Hamilton, Montana, where the mountains stood like old guardians. From the outside, it looked peaceful. Inside, the stillness sometimes felt like another kind of fire, slow, steady, hard to escape. His routine was simple. Up at 5, a short run on the dirt road, black coffee, no sugar, no cream. Check the weather radio, even though he no longer needed to. Habits cling like smoke. By 6, he was usually on the trail, walking alone. To neighbors, it might have seemed like the life of a man who enjoyed solitude. But the truth was different. Daniel wasn't walking for pleasure. He was walking to keep from stopping. You see, Daniel had once been a wildfire ranger, the kind who spent weeks on the line digging fire breaks, hauling hoses, sleeping under the stars that glowed red with smoke. He had fought blazes that devoured entire ridges, flames that sounded like freight trains. He had lost friends to firemen whose names he still whispered sometimes in the quiet of his kitchen. And though he had survived, he carried burns no one could see. Post-traumatic stress has many disguises. For Daniel, it looked like order, strict, sharp, unbending. His life after retirement was reduced to a handful of controlled steps, like walking the same trail every morning, because the unknown was harder than the steepest climb. On paper, he was free. No chains, no uniform, no alarms dragging him from bed. But freedom without purpose can feel like another prison. His daughter Leah, now in her late 20s, lived in Seattle and called less than she used to. Divorce had taken its toll years before, and the distance grew until he barely recognized her voice on the phone. They talked politely about work and the weather, but the silences in between said more. He told himself he didn't blame her. Who would want to keep reaching out to a man who always seemed far away even when he answered? So, Daniel turned to the wilderness. Not because it was easy, but because the wilderness asked nothing of him except presence. Step after step, breath after breath. He could disappear into the timber, listen to the rush of rivers, and watch elk move at dawn. Out there, he didn't have to explain himself. Out there, the memories of sirens and flames dulled at least for a while. It's important to understand this broken routine because without it, the chains in the clearing might have gone unnoticed. Daniel's morning hikes were not hobbies, they were survival. They gave him just enough space to keep going, just enough reason to put one boot in front of the other. And because he kept walking, he was there on the morning the sound of metal reached his ears. Here's an example that matters. A neighbor once asked Daniel why he walked every morning. He gave the easy answer, "Keeps me in shape." But the real answer was different. He walked because if he stopped, he would think. And if he thought too long, the fire came back, the shouts, the collapse of a ridge, the last glance from a friend whose name he could barely say. Walking kept the ghosts at a distance. This isn't unique to Daniel. Many veterans, first responders, and even people carrying private grief build routines that look ordinary on the outside but are lifelines on the inside. The small lesson here is this: never assume silence means peace. Sometimes silence means battle. A battle no one else sees. Daniel's life looked calm to the world, but inside he was still fighting flames. And when we understand that, we see why the bear cub's silent struggle in the clearing struck him so hard. It wasn't just her fight, it was his reflected at him. From a fresh perspective, Daniel's story reminds us that broken routines can still carry meaning. They may not look heroic, but they put us in places we need to be. His daily hike wasn't glamorous, wasn't shared on social media, but it positioned him exactly where he needed to stand that morning. Sometimes the ordinary rhythms of our lives become the channels for extraordinary moments. We think we are just passing the time. In reality, time is preparing us. And there is another truth here. Daniel's years as a ranger gave him more than scars. They gave him instincts. He knew how to read landscapes, how to notice details others would miss. A snapped branch, a shift in the wind, a faint call in the distance, small cues most people overlook. That's why he paused when he first heard the chain. Many would have dismissed it as background noise. He didn't. His training, his wounds, his relentless walks, all of it came together in that instant. And that convergence is what turned a routine into a rescue. Think for a moment about your own life. How many times have you been in the right place at the right time because of a habit you almost abandoned? Maybe you left the house a little early and met someone who changed your path. Maybe you lingered at the park and noticed a lost dog. Routine may feel dull, but it can be the quiet engine of grace. Daniel's broken pattern carried him straight into the clearing, where a chained grizzly cub needed him most. Wild animal stories often spotlight the creature, and rightly so. But the human side matters too, because animals don't rescue themselves from chains. People notice or they don't. People act or they don't. Daniel's brokenness positioned him to notice. His pain gave him empathy, and his discipline gave him presence. That combination turned him from a man lost in his own silence into the rescuer of a rare animal whose story would ripple far beyond that Montana meadow. The bear cub wasn't the first life Daniel had tried to save. In the fires, he'd hauled people from cabins, carried gear through walls of smoke, shielded others when the wind turned. Some he saved, some he didn't. Those losses carved deep into him. Saving a chained animal wasn't going to erase the past. But it was a chance to respond to suffering instead of ignoring it. A chance to do what he knew how to do, step forward even when it hurt. That's the fresh perspective worth holding on to. Rescue isn't always about heroism in front of cameras. It's about responding when silence presses on you. It's about noticing paw prints, Chain's eyes, signals that would vanish if you looked away. Daniel didn't set out to be part of an animal rescue that morning. He just set out to walk, and because he did, the bear cub's fight to live intersected with his own fight to keep moving. As he climbed a ridge that morning, Daniel thought only of his breathing, his boots, the crunch of frost on the grass. He didn't know that just beyond the bend was a living being tethered to despair. But his presence there was no accident. His broken routine had led him directly to her. And so the story tightens. A man bound by memories meets a cub bound by chains. Both are caught in cycles of suffering. Both are waiting for something to break. Daniel Carter had always known the line between fear and duty was thin. Years of firefighting had forced him across it more times than he cared to count. But standing in that Montana clearing with a young grizzly bear chained to the ground, he felt the weight of that line in a new way. She was watching him. Her dark eyes flicked from his face to the chain at her neck, back to him again, as if trying to read whether he was a threat or salvation. The air between them held steady. No growl, no movement, just the sound of her shallow breath and the faint pull of the chain when she shifted. Daniel's instincts warred with each other. One part screamed caution. This was still a grizzly cub, a wild animal bred for mountains, not for mercy. Another part, the deeper part, whispered that doing nothing was the most dangerous choice of all. Fear and duty had met head-on before in his life, but never like this. He stepped closer, one boot crunching into the frost. She didn't lunge. She didn't retreat. She only pressed her paw into the dirt, leaving a print beside the iron stake. Daniel noticed how it overlapped with dozens of others. Circle of pacing repeated endlessly. He thought of soldiers who walked the same guard path night after night, trapped in patterns that wore grooves into their souls. He knew what it meant to be tethered. Here's the explanation worth pausing on. Rescue is not a single act. It's a series of choices made under pressure. Do you call for help or act now? Do you break the chain or wait for backup? Do you risk yourself or let another living being continue to suffer? Each question is a weight, and the answers rarely arrive cleanly. Daniel reached for his phone. His hands, steady in firestorms, now trembled as he dialed the sheriff's office. This is Carter. I've got a situation. Young bear, chained, still alive but weak. The dispatcher's tone shifted immediately. Stay back, sir. Wildlife Services will send a team. He heard the professionalism, the caution. 15 minutes, maybe 20. He looked at the cub again. Her sides heaved fast, her paws raw. Did she have 15 minutes? Example time. The Humane Society estimates that in the U.S., hundreds of pets die each summer in hot cars, many within just minutes of being left unattended. Owners always think they'll be right back. Neglect hides in those small assumptions. Daniel saw the same assumption here. Someone had thought this cub could wait, but the body doesn't wait. Chains crush slowly, just as heat suffocates slowly. Both kill by degrees. Daniel had been trained to respect the chain of command, but he also knew the chain of compassion. It often moved faster. He dropped the phone back into his pocket. His pulse quickened. He remembered something his old captain once told him: fear is natural, but duty is a choice. That line came rushing back. He could feel the heat of past fires in his chest, the adrenaline that made his vision sharpen. He wasn't a ranger anymore. But duty didn't retire. The small lesson is this: hesitation is not neutral. When you stand still in front of suffering, you are still making a choice to let it continue. Daniel realized that standing frozen in that clearing was its own kind of action, and it was the wrong one. So he moved. Slowly, carefully, he circled to the side, scanning for tools. His backpack carried rope, a small hatchet, and a multi-tool. Enough for makeshift options. The cub's ears twitched, tracking him. No aggression, just exhausted awareness. She had been waiting too long to waste energy on fear. And here's a fresh perspective. We often see wild animals as symbols of untamed power, creatures we should fear. But when chained, they reveal something else, our own responsibility. The danger is not their strength, it's our neglect. That cub wasn't dangerous at that moment. She was endangered, and that difference was everything. Daniel crouched near the stake, careful to keep space between them. The chain links were rusted thick, too much for his multi-tool. He pressed the blade anyway, testing. The cub flinched at the sound, then stilled eyes locked on him. It felt like a test one for both of them. He whispered almost unconsciously, the way he used to with frightened survivors, pulled from smoke. "Easy, girl. I'm here." Words meant nothing to a grizzly cub, yet tone carried power. Animals read intention before language. The cub blinked slowly, her breathing still rapid but steady. It reminded Daniel of training dogs in search and rescue drills. He remembered how his old partner, a Labrador named Scout, would pause mid-rubble, ears tuned not to words but to the calm beneath them. Scout had trusted him, and together they had pulled people from collapsed homes. Now, years later, Daniel was doing the same thing, except the victim was a bear chained in a meadow. The technique was the same: stay calm, steady, your voices. Show you mean no harm. He pulled the hatchet from his pack. The metal glinted briefly in the morning light. He angled it at the stake, not the chain, knowing it was safer to free the ground than the neck. He raised it, hesitated. Duty pressed hard, fear pressed harder. This was the moment. He struck. The hatchet bit into the soil beside the stake. The sound jolted through the clearing. The cub flinched but didn't bolt. She couldn't. Daniel struck again. Each swing carried not just force but decision. The ground gave a little dirt, loosening. The stake shifted. Another strike. The cub whined low, not a growl, but the sound of exhaustion mixed with hope. It was working. The stake wobbled. Daniel planted his boot against it, pushed. The metal resisted, then shifted further. One more swing, one more push, and the stake leaned. The chain slackened. The cub blinked, almost confused. For the first time, and who knows how long, the circle around her widened. Here's the perspective: to take home freedom often begins small. Not the full breaking of chains, but a little more room to breathe. A little more slack. A sign that someone is trying. That's true for animals and for us. Daniel knew it too well, how a kind word or a single phone call during his darkest nights had given him just enough space to make it to morning. Rescue is rarely instant. It starts with inches. He paused, breath heavy. He looked at the cub. She looked back. Two beings bound in different ways, sharing one fragile clearing. He pressed the stake again. It leaned further, then finally broke free of the soil. The chain sagged. The cub stumbled unsteady, then sat heavily, too weak to run. Daniel exhaled. Fear hadn't vanished, but duty had won. And in that moment, he realized something important. Duty is not about heroics. It's about showing up even when you're shaking. He pulled his phone again, called the dispatcher back. "She's free of the ground, still chained at the neck. Weak. Send your team fast." His voice was steady now. He had done what he could. The rest would need hands trained for wildlife rescue. And that's another small lesson. Knowing your limits doesn't make you weak. It makes your help sustainable. Daniel had done what was possible without causing more harm. He had bought her time. And sometimes that's the difference between life and death. Across the U.S. laws vary on what civilians can do when they encounter animals in danger. Some states protect good Samaritans who break car windows to save pets in extreme heat. Others still punish property damage more than neglect. But the principle remains: hesitation kills, action saves. Daniel didn't wait for perfect legality. He leaned on compassion. The clearing felt different now. The scrape of the chain no longer echoed. The cub lay on her side, eyes still open, breathing, still shallow. But in the silence, Daniel heard something else. The quiet relief of knowing he had chosen duty. The stake was out of the ground. but the chain still held the young grizzly at her neck. Daniel could feel the weight of her struggle even in the silence. She had stopped pacing, stopped pulling. She simply sat there, breathing fast, waiting. That paused stillness from a creature built to roam was a warning. And that's where the science begins. Grizzlies are not meant for circles. Their biology is written for distance. A wild bear can cover 40 miles in a single day, following rivers, turning stones, chasing salmon runs, and digging for roots. Every step builds muscle, burns calories, trains organs. Restrict that movement and the body begins to fold in on itself. Muscles shrink, joints stiffen. The heart works harder for less. Survival isn't just about food or water, it's about motion. Daniel remembered something from his ranger days. In the back of the firehouse, they once kept a Dalmatian chained behind the trucks. She barked endlessly at the door, desperate to run with the crew. When they finally let her ride along one night, she bolted out of the truck like her lungs had been starved. Within weeks, her muscles filled out. Her coat shone. Freedom had healed her faster than medicine. What the firehouse dog experienced in weeks, the grizzly cub had endured for months. Here's a clear explanation. Confinement doesn't just limit space, it rewrites the brain. Scientists call it zoochosis, repetitive pacing, head weaving, chewing metal bars. It's the animal mind collapsing under monotony. In bears, it shows up as endless circles, worn into dirt, the same paw prints laid down until they blur into trenches. The body weakens, but the spirit weakens faster. An example makes it sharper. A black bear, once rescued from a roadside attraction in North Carolina, had spent 10 years in a cage barely larger than a pickup bed. When released into the sanctuary space, he walked in circles for days, unable to believe in open ground. It took months of patience before he finally broke the pattern. That story is common in sanctuaries across America. The body can heal, but the memory of chains takes longer. Survival isn't just the absence of death, it's the presence of life. A chained animal may breathe, may eat scraps, may outlast a season. But that isn't living, that's waiting. The same truth holds for people. Daniel knew it well. He had survived wildfires, divorce, and long years of silence. But survival without motion, without purpose, had felt like another kind of chain. He saw himself in the cub's stillness, and he knew what would happen if no one acted. We often think of endangered animals as threatened by hunters or shrinking forests. And yes, those dangers are real. But confinement chains. Cages, cars left in the heat is a quieter killer. According to the Humane Society, hundreds of pets die every year in hot vehicles. A car's interior can rise by 20 degrees in just 10 minutes. At 120 degF, organs begin to fail. At 140 degF, death can come in under an hour. People still leave animals just for a minute. Neglect often hides under good intentions. The grizzly cub in the clearing had no car to overheat in, but the science was the same. Her chain had stripped her body of its natural cooling system. Bears pace rivers to regulate temperature. They climb for shade. They dig shallow pits to lie in cool dirt. Take away those options and heat builds quietly inside. Dehydration follows, then collapse. Daniel crouched a little closer, studying her breath. He wasn't a veterinarian, but he had seen animals in distress before. The shallow panting, the glazed eyes, the patches of rubbed skin with a chain cut. It was textbook neglect. He thought of something his daughter once told him during a rare phone call. She had read an article about compassion fatigue, how caregivers sometimes shut down after seeing too much suffering. Dad, she'd said, the danger isn't caring too much. The danger is when you stop caring at all. Looking at the cub, Daniel understood. Whoever chained her here had already stopped caring. Here's where the science meets the soul. A grizzly's survival is a masterpiece of adaptation. Their sense of smell can pick up carrion miles away. Their claws can turn a log like flipping a coin. Their fat reserves carry them through brutal winters of hibernation. Every part of them is built for freedom. To chain one is not just cruelty, it is a violation of design. In Yellowstone, researchers once tracked a female grizzly who roamed over 500 square miles in a single season. Her path crossed rivers, roads, and ridges. She lived because she moved. Compare that to the cub in the clearing who had known nothing but a patch of earth the size of a kitchen rug. The contrast is the science of survival distilled into one image. Motion is life. Confinement is death. How often do we chain ourselves in smaller ways? Habits that trap fears that circle us. Grief that paces endlessly in the mind. We survive. Yes. But do we live? Watching the cub, Daniel asked himself that question. The answer unsettled him. Across the United States, laws about animal confinement vary. Some states allow roadside menageries, cages no larger than a bedroom, so long as owners claim educational value. Others enforce stricter bans, recognizing that bears, lions, and tigers are not props for photographs. But legislation lags behind compassion. Until people see these animals not as spectacles, but as lives. Chains will keep appearing in clearings. Daniel's own duty was immediate: free her, call help, buy her time. But beyond the clearing, the duty belonged to all of us, to vote for stronger protections, to support sanctuaries, to educate neighbors who think a chained bear is no big deal. Because if we ignore one chain, we ignore them all. He thought again of that Dalmatian at the firehouse, the way she had sprinted free once her tether was cut. The joy in her movement, that memory gave him hope. Maybe this cub too could relearn freedom. Maybe the circle worn into the dirt could be broken. Daniel pressed his palm briefly to the loose stake he had pulled. It was still warm from the sun. The chain rattled faintly. He whispered again, though he wasn't sure why. Hold on. Help is coming. And that is the mystery why we talk to animals when they cannot answer in our language. Maybe because deep down we know they are answering in their own. A slow blink, a softened breath, a paw lifted just slightly as if to test the idea of trust. Communication doesn't always need words. It needs presence. The cub's paw prints circled tightly in the dirt, each one overlapping the next. To Daniel, they looked like messages written in code, not unlike the paw prints his daughter's childhood cat used to leave on their porch after rain, tiny signatures saying, "I was here." I matter. That's what the cub's prints said too. I matter. Don't walk away. The growl of engines broke the clearing's silence. Dust curled up from the dirt road as two trucks pulled in, one marked with the green insignia of Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks, the other carrying the logo of a local animal rescue group. Daniel stepped back, relief rushing through him. He had kept the cub alive long enough for help to arrive, but he also knew this was only the beginning. Two people climbed out first, a wildlife officer named Marcus and a veterinarian, Dr. Emily Rodriguez. Daniel knew the type. Calm eyes, steady hands. People who had seen enough emergencies to learn that panic only wastes time. Marcus nodded at him, then turned his attention to the bear. Emily opened a case, pulling out gloves, syringes, and IV lines. "Good call getting the stake loose," Marcus said. "You bought her breathing room." His tone carried the weight of experience, someone who had seen bears too far gone. Chains too tight. Daniel felt both humbled and unsettled. This wasn't a victory. It was survival on the edge. Here's the explanation worth noting. Rescue is only step one. Healing is what decides whether survival turns into life. Chains damage more than skin. They cut into trust, into instinct, into the very rhythm of a creature's body. The work ahead for this cub was as much about the spirit as it was about the wounds. Emily approached slowly, voice low movements, deliberate. She spoke softly, even though the cub could not understand the words. Animals read tone long before they read intention. "Easy now, we're here to help." She prepared a tranquilizer, explaining to Daniel that stress alone could kill an animal this week. Too much adrenaline and the heart can fail. The dart struck gently into the cub's flank. She flinched, tried to rise, then sagged against the dirt. Daniel's chest tightened. Even unconscious, she looked fragile, too small for the weight she had carried. Emily and Marcus moved fast, securing the chain, checking her breathing, and loading her onto a stretcher. Daniel followed without being asked, his hands steadying one corner as they lifted her into the truck. Example. Emily pointed to the cub's raw paws and the rubbed patch around her neck. Classic confinement injuries. Infection risk is high. Dehydration severe. But she's young. Youth is resilience. Daniel nodded, remembering the firehouse dog years ago. He thought of survivors pulled from collapsed cabins, bodies battered, eyes vacant, yet somehow still alive. The pattern was the same where there was breath, there was hope. Saving someone doesn't mean the fight is over. It means the fight changes shape. After trauma, survival becomes about patience, about showing up every day to tend wounds, to build back trust. Whether it's a grizzly cub, a family dog, or a person scarred by loss, healing doesn't arrive in one dramatic moment. It arrives in quiet persistence. The drive to the sanctuary took hours. Daniel followed behind his old truck, rumbling in their dust. He wasn't asked to come, but he couldn't make himself turn back. Something in him had shifted. It wasn't curiosity. It was a connection. The cub's paw prints in the dirt had pressed into him deeper than he'd expected. At Yellowstone Wildlife Sanctuary, staff met them at the gate. Volunteers moved quickly, preparing an enclosure lined with soft straw, shaded by tall timbers. Emily gave instructions: fluids, antibiotics, wound cleaning, and observation. Daniel stood back, watching the cub's small chest rise and fall under the effects of sedation. Sanctuaries are not just cages with bigger fences. They are bridges. They take animals broken by captivity and give them the closest thing to wild freedom possible. Not release into open mountains, they may never survive that. But release from pain, from chains, from circles of dirt that steal life, one step at a time. The cub's chain was cut from her neck. The sound of it falling to the ground echoed louder than Daniel expected. For her, it was freedom. For him, it was a reminder. Chains are never just metal. They are memories. She would carry the ghost of that collar long after her wounds healed. The staff named her Aspen, after the trees that turn gold each fall across Montana valleys. Daniel thought it was fitting. Aspens grow in clusters, their roots intertwined beneath the soil. Even when one tree falls, the grove survives connected. The cub's survival would depend on roots. She couldn't see the quiet support of people who refused to let her story end in a clearing. An example from the sanctuary's past underscored this truth. Years before, they had rescued another bear, a black bear cub found starving in a backyard cage. That animal had arrived thin, distrustful, nearly feral. Yet within months, with medical care and gentle handling, she had begun to climb logs, splash in ponds, reclaim instincts nearly lost. Today, she still lives at the sanctuary, thriving, a reminder that healing is possible even when freedom was not absolute. Aspen's journey would mirror that one. The lesson Daniel took from all this was one he hadn't expected. Healing doesn't erase scars, it teaches how to live with them. He had resisted that truth for years, burying his own memories under routine. But watching Aspen, he saw it clearly. She would never forget the chain. Neither would he forget the fire. Yet both could learn to move forward, scarred but alive. Emily spoke with him later after Aspen was settled in her new enclosure. She's stable for now. We'll know more in 24 hours. Young ones bounce back faster, but trauma leaves marks you can't see. Daniel nodded. He knew she was speaking about more than the bear. A fresh perspective emerged for Daniel as he stood by the fence. Healing is never solitary. The cub would not recover alone. She had a team: vets, volunteers, strangers who donated to sanctuaries, and perhaps in some small way him. Healing for people is no different. We like to think strength is independence, but often strength is the willingness to let others help. As the day dimmed, Aspen stirred under sedation. Her paw twitched, brushing against straw instead of hard, packed dirt. It was a small motion, but Daniel felt his chest loosen. The circle had been broken. She was writing new prints now, no longer desperate messages in dirt, but tentative beginnings of recovery. And here lies the mystery. We don't always know why certain lives intersect with ours. Why one man's broken routine led him to one chained cub in a clearing. His decision to stop walking became the start of a second chance for them both. Perhaps healing isn't something we choose as much as something we stumble into moments that call us to act, and by acting we find ourselves mending too. Aspen was safe behind the gates of Yellowstone Wildlife Sanctuary. Her wounds were cleaned, her breathing steadier. But Daniel knew she wasn't the only one. For every cub freed from a chain, dozens more remained unseen, confined in cages, backyards, or roadside attractions. The clearing in Montana was not a random horror. It was a symptom of something larger. Here's the clear explanation. Across the United States, thousands of wild animals live in captivity outside accredited zoos or sanctuaries. Bears, tigers, lions, and even wolves are kept as pets. Entertainment props or educational exhibits. Federal estimates suggest that more than 10,000 big cats and bears are privately held, many in inadequate or illegal conditions. Some states ban this outright. Others allow it with minimal oversight. Cruelty persists because loopholes exist, and where there is profit or pride, neglect often follows. Daniel heard Emily mention it while updating a staff member. We see cases like Aspen's all the time. Some are chained, some locked in sheds, some are in rusty cages by gas stations. People convince themselves it's harmless or temporary or somehow educational. Meanwhile, the animals break down. She didn't speak with anger. She spoke with fatigue, the tone of someone who has repeated the same truth too many times. An example makes the picture real. A black bear in North Carolina spent a decade in a roadside cage no larger than a pickup bed. Tourists tossed marshmallows at him through bars. When he was finally rescued, his teeth were worn flat from gnawing metal. His body carried scars from pacing in endless circles. That bear's story echoed Aspen's, just on a longer, crueler timeline. Captivity often begins with excuses. It's just until she's bigger. It's for training. It's for the kids to see. Chains rarely arrive as villains. They arrive disguised as good intentions until neglect grows too obvious to hide. Aspen's captor probably told himself a story too. But excuses do not erase paw prints in dirt. We tend to picture endangered animals in distant jungles or tundras. But the reality is closer. In America's forests and suburbs, animals suffer because laws vary like a patchwork. Tennessee and California, for example, protect citizens who break car windows to save pets in extreme heat. But many states still punish the rescuer more harshly than the neglectful owner. For wildlife oversight is even murkier. One county may enforce strict bans while the next allows roadside menageries with minimal inspections. Compassion stops at borders drawn in ink. Daniel thought of his daughter again. Leah once told him that systems reflect the choices people make together. If we don't demand change, dad neglect becomes normal. She had been talking about housing policy in her city, but the truth applied here too. If enough people look away, chains remain invisible. If enough people speak, chains break. Another example, in 2017, authorities in Texas seized dozens of tigers and bears from private backyards. Many owners claimed they were providing love and care, but veterinarians found malnutrition, untreated infections, and psychological trauma. When moved to sanctuary, the animals responded with relief so clear it was undeniable, rolling in grass, splashing in water, exploring space for the first time in years. That transformation testified to what neglect had stolen. The small lesson deepens systemic problems. Persist because they are hidden behind personal stories. Owners frame themselves as caretakers. Businesses frame cages as attractions. Laws frame cruelty as property rights. Meanwhile, animals write their own stories in paw prints and pacing paths, but no one reads them until Daniel stumbles into a clearing. For Daniel, the fresh perspective came quietly. Standing at Aspen's enclosure, listening to volunteers describe other rescues, he realized his morning walk had connected him not just to one cub, but to a network of suffering and healing he had never considered. He had always seen wilderness as something vast, untouchable. Now he understood it was fragile, dependent on choices made in kitchens, offices, and legislatures far from the forest. This is why animal sanctuaries matter. They are more than safe havens. They are living arguments against the idea that wild animals belong in chains. Every grizzly bear, black bear, or cougar who recovers inside a sanctuary is a counterpoint to every excuse used to justify confinement. They prove that healing is possible, but also that prevention is necessary. Without sanctuaries, the cycle would stay invisible. Daniel thought of Aspen's chain now lying useless in the sanctuary's tool shed. To most people, it was just metal. To him, it was evidence. Evidence that systems fail, that people justify, that animals pay the price. Evidence that cruelty repeats unless someone stops it. And here's the lesson for all of us. Neglect is rarely dramatic. It is quiet. A bear is chained behind a barn. A dog is left in a car with the windows rolled up. A parrot in a cage too small for its wings to spread. The pattern is the same silence. Unless someone interrupts it, continues. Unless communities demand laws, shelters, and accountability chains, stay hidden until it's too late. Fresh perspective also means acknowledging the role of compassion in systemic change. Individual rescues inspire collective movements. When videos of animals saved from hot cars go viral, legislators notice. When sanctuaries share stories of survival donors, step forward. Compassion ripples outward, reshaping laws and expectations. Aspen's rescue, small in the scale of global crises, was part of that ripple. Daniel understood something new that evening as he watched Aspen sleep on straw instead of dirt. Systems may allow cruelty, but individuals decide whether cruelty continues. He had stumbled into a clearing and chosen duty. Now the question was whether others would see their own clearings, their own chances to notice, to act, to speak for those who cannot. When Daniel left the sanctuary that night, the image of Aspen pressed into his mind. Her small chest rising and falling, the chain finally gone. He thought it might end there, with one cub, one clearing, one choice. But stories have a way of traveling farther than we expect. The ripples began quietly, then widened, until they touched shores he had never imagined. Here's the clear explanation. Individual rescues often spark something larger because they give a face, a paw, a pair of eyes to a problem that feels too big. People may ignore statistics about thousands of animals in captivity, but they lean closer when they see one bear cub chained in a Montana meadow. A single life makes the abstract real. Aspen's story traveled first through the sanctuary's newsletter. Volunteers shared photos of her recovery, her fur beginning to fill in her paws, wrapped for healing. Local reporters caught the thread writing about the chained grizzly cub of Hamilton Valley. Soon the photos reached social media, where images of paw prints in circles spoke louder than columns of numbers. Within weeks, Aspen was no longer just Daniel's story. She was everyone's. An example shows how ripples grow. Years earlier, a video of a police officer breaking a car window to save a dog in Arizona went viral. That clip did more than praise one officer. It spurred petitions, shifted statehouse conversations, and eventually contributed to new Good Samaritan laws that protect rescuers who act. A single rescue became a movement. Aspen's story carried the same potential. Daniel noticed it when Leah called. His daughter's voice, distant for so long, now carried excitement. "Dad, I saw the article. People at my office are talking about it. They said you were there. Is it true?" For the first time in years, she sounded proud of him. That moment mattered more than the headlines. Aspen had reconnected not just a community, but a family. Ripples don't just spread outward, they circle back. An act of compassion for a stranger animal or human often repairs fractures in our own lives. By saving Aspen, Daniel found a way back to his daughter. The paw prints that had seemed like Morse code in the dirt became messages between them. Communities respond to rescue stories because they offer hope. In a world filled with news of loss, a single act of compassion reminds people that change is still possible. Sanctuary staff noticed an uptick in donations, volunteers, and school groups asking to visit. Aspen's fight to live is teaching kids more than textbooks ever could, one teacher said. The cub had become a teacher without speaking a word. National organizations also noticed. Wildlife groups highlighted Aspen in campaigns about illegal captivity. Lawmakers in Helena referenced her case during debates on stronger penalties for chaining wild animals. Though laws move slowly, Aspen's presence in those halls mattered. She was no longer invisible. Daniel saw the broader ripple one morning when he walked into a diner in town. Strangers nodded, recognizing him from a photo that had circulated online, him crouched in the clearing, hand steadying the steak before pulling it loose. He hadn't sought attention, but recognition found him anyway. A man at the counter said quietly, "My grandkids saw that bear's story. Made them ask me about our own dog. We built him a bigger pen last weekend." Small changes, but changes all the same. Another example, after Hurricane Katrina. Images of dogs stranded on rooftops stirred public outrage. That outrage led to the Pets Act of 2006, requiring states to include pets in disaster planning. One disaster, many rescues, one law. Aspen's chain was lighter than a hurricane, but the ripple worked the same way. One cub, one clearing. Many eyes opened. Systems change when stories move hearts. Data builds arguments, but stories build movements. Aspen's story reminded people not only of wild bears in Montana, but of pets in their neighborhoods, animals in their shelters, creatures in faraway forests. Chains take many forms. Compassion does too. Daniel, who had once lived in silence, now found himself speaking. He was invited to a local school to talk about Aspen. He told the kids what he saw that morning, the paw prints circling the chain scraping. He didn't dramatize. He simply explained that sometimes survival depends on one person stopping to care. The classroom grew quiet, the kind of quiet where seeds sink deep. One boy raised his hand. "If I see an animal hurt, can I help?" Daniel answered honestly. "You can. You should. And you should call others to help too." Ripples remind us that no act of compassion stands alone. Each is linked to a chain of others. Daniel's decision to stop walking led to Aspen's survival. Aspen's survival led to community awareness. Awareness led to donations laws and education. And perhaps those children in that classroom will someday act in their own clearings, multiplying the ripple again. Aspen herself embodied the ripple. Weeks after her arrival, she stood on her paws long enough to take her first steps into the sanctuary's outdoor enclosure. Volunteers cheered quietly, not to startle her. The photos of her tentative walk reached thousands online. To most, it was just a bear cub stretching. To Daniel, it was the moment freedom shifted from theory to reality. A life that had been written in circles was writing forward again. And here's the mystery worth holding on to. We never know which stories will spread. Daniel hadn't set out to inspire anyone. He hadn't planned to become part of a viral rescue. He had only acted on duty in a clearing, yet the ripples of that decision reached lawmakers' classrooms, strangers in diners, and his own daughter. The world had been waiting for paw prints to read, and Aspen provided them. Daniel Carter never forgot the sound of the chains scraping in that Montana clearing. But over time, what stayed with him even more were the paw prints. Dozens of them pressed into the dirt in circles so tight they told a story without words. Those prints were the bear cub's desperate diary, written in silence, waiting for someone to read. Here's the clear explanation. Paw prints are more than marks in the ground. For Aspen, they were proof of her fight to live. Every step around that stake was a refusal to give up. Every loop was survival carried out one pace at a time. In that way, paw prints are like the scars we all carry, evidence that we kept moving even when trapped. An example makes this real. At the sanctuary, weeks later, Aspen pressed her paws into fresh snow for the first time. No circles, no chains, just tracks leading forward across white ground. A volunteer photographed them. When the photo was shared, people responded with awe. "She's free now," one wrote. Another said, "Her prints remind me of my own journey out of depression." That's the power of paw prints. They belong to one life, yet they speak to many. Survival is not passive. It is active, insistent. Aspen did not wait to be saved. She kept moving in circles until the right person arrived. In our own lives, survival often looks the same. We may not roar or lash out. Sometimes it looks like showing up to work when we'd rather hide, or calling a friend when silence feels easier, or getting out of bed when grief presses heavily. Each step, like each paw print, is a message: I'm still here. Don't stop looking for me. Knowledge adds depth. Science tells us that wild animals are designed to move, adapt, and persist. Grizzly bears roam miles daily. Captivity breaks that design. Humans are no different. We are built for connection, resilience, and healing. Trauma may confine us, but we are wired to seek light. That's why survivors, animal and human, carry within them the possibility of recovery. Sanctuaries prove it. Families prove it. Communities prove it when they choose compassion over neglect. Daniel's own emotions shifted alongside Aspen's recovery. He began visiting the sanctuary weekly, not out of duty, but because her presence steadied him. Watching her paw prints stretch in straight lines instead of circles reminded him that healing was possible even for himself. For years he had lived in the tight loops of silence and routine. Aspen taught him to step forward again. Aspen's chain may have been literal, but each of us faces chains of our own fear, regret, loneliness, habits that confine. The paw prints we leave, our actions, our words, our choices show whether we stay trapped or move toward freedom. Breaking free doesn't happen in one moment. It happens in daily steps, sometimes shaky, but steps nonetheless. Another example: after Aspen's story spread, families across Montana began posting their own paw print photos online. Kids traced their dog's paws in sidewalk chalk with the words, "Safe at home." A teacher sent in drawings her students made of wild animals running free. People had found a symbol in Aspen's struggle, a way to connect their own small actions to something larger. The ripple Daniel had never planned was now shaping lives he would never meet. And that's the final lesson: compassion multiplies. One act in a clearing became a chain of acts across a nation. That is how systemic change begins, not with policies first, but with people moved to act. Laws follow stories. Stories follow choices. Choices begin with noticing paw prints that others ignore. So here is the mystery left for you. What paw prints surround you right now? Maybe they belong to a neglected animal in your neighborhood. Maybe they belong to a friend too quiet for too long, or a neighbor carrying weight you haven't seen. Paw prints are everywhere. They are the signals of lives asking to be noticed. The question is whether we will stop long enough to read them. Daniel's story and Aspen's survival remind us that second chances are real. They remind us that healing is not just about escaping chains, but about finding a sanctuary, whether that's a place, a person, or a community. And they remind us that paw prints once ignored can become maps towards something greater. As Aspen grew stronger, she began to climb logs in her enclosure, splash in pools, and leave trails of tracks leading to new places. Each print marked a step away from confinement, a step toward purpose. For Daniel, each visit marked the same. He started writing letters to Leah again, not out of obligation, but because he wanted her to know the steps he was taking. The chain inside him was loosening too. Now the call comes to us. What will you do with the paw prints you see? Will you walk past them, or will you stop as Daniel did and choose duty over fear? Will you support sanctuaries that give wild animals like Aspen a second chance? Will you speak up when you see neglect? Will you volunteer, donate, or share stories that remind others? Compassion is possible. This is not just Aspen's story. It is an invitation. The paw prints on her window of life were SOS signals waiting for someone to notice. Today, paw prints surround you too, in news feeds, in shelters, in conversations. They are waiting for eyes willing to see and hearts willing to act. So here is your reflection. Think about the chains you've broken in your own life and the paw prints you've left behind. Who noticed them? Who stopped for you? And who is waiting now for you to notice theirs? If Aspen's story touched you, if her fight to live stirred something in you, don't let the ripple stop here. Let it move outward. Leave a comment sharing your own rescue story, whether it's about an animal, a person, or yourself. Your words may be the paw prints someone else needs to read today. And if you believe these stories matter, if you want more people to see the fight and the healing of rare animals, of grizzly bears, of wild creatures who deserve more than chains, then please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with others. Together, our paw prints can become a trail wide enough to lead toward change. End of story.